They say the walls of a mansion hide more than wealth. They hide whispers, unspoken vows, and secrets that money cannot bury. In this house, laughter echoed in the halls, fine wines flowed at grand tables, and guests praised the name of the man who owned it all. Yet, in the silence between footsteps, in the shadows where no guest dared to look, a different story was unfolding. A story that began with a girl named Amara, a maid who worked with quiet devotion, unseen by the glittering world around her. To them, she was just another servant, carrying trays and scrubbing floors. But to her, every moment inside this mansion carried a memory. Every room, every chair, every portrait on the wall, all of it tied to a past no one else remembered. And that night, when the world thought it was watching a celebration, Amara was waiting for her moment. Waiting for the question no maid had ever asked her master before. A question so bold, so unthinkable that when it escaped her lips, it left everyone frozen. She knelt before him, tears running down her cheeks, and said softly, "Please, kiss me before it's too late." Guests gasped. The music stopped, and a silence heavier than the walls of the mansion fell on every soul in that room. Before you hear the reason behind her shocking request, tell me, where are you watching this from? Do not stay silent, because silence, in this story, carries a weight you'll soon understand. But how did it come to this? How did a maid born in a forgotten village find herself at the center of a storm that would shatter one of the wealthiest families in the land? To answer that, we must go back. Back to the mornings when Amara polished silver while listening to hushed arguments between her master and his wife. Back to the evenings when she carried a tray into the study and found Mr. Attawale coughing into a handkerchief, staining it with blood, hiding it before anyone else could see. Back to the days when her eyes lingered on him longer than a servant should, not with desire, but with a pain that only she understood. If you believe your life can never be overturned in a single moment, share this story now. Someone you know is walking blindly toward a truth that will break them. The night of the party was supposed to be perfect. The chandeliers blazed with light, the courtyard filled with expensive cars, and laughter spilled like wine across every corner of the estate. But while the world toasted to Attawale's success, Amara's hands trembled as she poured champagne into crystal glasses. She knew what no one else knew. She had carried it for years, like a fire hidden beneath her heart. And when the moment came, when her master stumbled before his guests, his face pale, his body weakened, Amara's heart pounded louder than the music. She knew this was the moment her secret would no longer remain hers alone. If you were in Amara's place, if the one person you swore to protect was slipping away before your eyes, what would you do? Would you stay silent, or would you risk everything to speak? Comment below. But that stumble, it was not just weakness. It was a revelation. For years, Attawale, the man dressed in riches, had been hiding a truth that ate at him quietly. His hands shook when no one was looking. His lips grew pale when the laughter grew loud. And Amara, the maid no one noticed, had seen every single moment of it. She carried his secret silently, waiting for the day when silence would no longer be enough. The guests thought it was a fainting spell, nothing more. They rushed forward with fans, with water, with useless chatter. But Amara did not move at first. She stood frozen, her eyes locked on him, as though she alone understood the meaning of what just happened. And then, slowly, carefully, she stepped forward. Every head turned. The room grew still. The music, once triumphant, was gone. She reached him before anyone else could. She placed her hand on his trembling shoulder, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Please, please remember who you are." No one understood. The wife narrowed her eyes. The guests whispered. But Attawale's eyes, they flickered with recognition. For a moment, just a moment, it was as if time itself had bent backward. To understand why those words carried the weight of a lifetime, we must return to where it began. Not in a mansion, not under chandeliers, but in a small village where the earth cracked from hunger and where survival was a daily prayer. Adewale had not always been a man of riches. Long ago he was a boy of dust, his belly hollow, his feet bare. He wandered into Amara's village with nothing but a broken spirit. And while the world ignored him, while others mocked him, one woman did not. Amara's mother, a woman with calloused hands and a heart stronger than stone, took him in. She gave him food when she herself went without. She gave him shelter when rain tore the thatched roofs apart. And though he was not her blood, she treated him as though he were born from her very body. Amara was only a child then, but she remembered. She remembered the boy with sad eyes sitting at their table, too weak to lift the spoon. She remembered her mother's words, whispered in the dark. One day, this boy will forget where he came from, and when that day comes, you must not let him. It was not a warning, it was a prophecy, a burden placed upon her small shoulders. Years passed. Adewale left the village. He rose through fortunes, through deals whispered in offices, through risks taken with iron will. He built his empire on stones of ambition, and as wealth clothed him, the memory of hunger drifted further away. Amara, still just a girl, grew into a woman. Her mother's health withered until one night, breathless and weak, she clutched Amara's hand. "He will not remember," she said, "but you must. Even if the world calls you nothing, even if they call you servant, remember. Protect him, even from himself." And so, when opportunity came, Amara stepped into his world again, not as his equal, not as his guest, but as his maid. She chose silence over revelation. She chose service over pride. She worked in his house, carrying trays, folding clothes, sweeping marble floors, not for money, but for memory. And every day she watched him drift further from the boy she once knew, until that night, when his body betrayed him before all his guests, when the truth he had hidden behind riches finally surfaced in weakness. That was the moment she could no longer remain silent. If you know someone who has forgotten their beginnings, share this story with them. They may not admit it, but they need the reminder. When Amara fell to her knees that night, when her tears struck the marble floor, the crowd thought it was madness. They thought it was desperation. But her words, her request for a kiss, it was not born of desire. It was not the cry of a woman seeking romance. It was the cry of a child who had carried a promise, a burden, a memory that would not let her rest. She wanted him to remember, to feel the weight of her mother's sacrifice, to recall that once, before all the riches, before the pride, before the name that echoed in every corner of the city, he had been just a boy, saved by love that expected nothing in return. And as she whispered those words, his hands shook, not from sickness, but from recognition. The boy he once was stood before him in her face, in her tears, in her voice. And for the first time in decades, he remembered. The mansion that night was no longer just a place of wealth. It was a stage where truth demanded to be heard, and while the world looked at her with judgment, while the wife's eyes burned with jealousy, while the guests whispered of scandal, Adewale saw something else. He saw his childhood. He saw the woman who once saved him. He saw the promise he had broken. And in that moment, he faced the question no riches could answer. Would he embrace the truth that had come to claim him, or would he turn away once more? The silence in that room was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of revelation. A wealthy man, a trembling body, a maid kneeling before him, and a request no guest could understand. But what they witnessed was only the surface. Beneath it lay decades of forgotten debts, broken promises, and the unspoken loyalty of a servant who carried far more than trays of wine. The guests whispered to one another, their voices sharp with judgment. A maid daring to touch the master, a maid daring to ask such a thing. To them, it was scandal. To Amara, it was destiny. Her tears on the marble floor were not the tears of shame, but of memory. Memory that clawed its way back to life in the very moment he fell. The weight of her mother's dying words pressed against her chest, words she had carried for years without release. Protect him, remind him, even when the world forgets. And now, the world had not only forgotten, it had erased. Adewale, the boy who once depended on scraps to live, was now the man seated at feasts, and yet his body betrayed him. His spirit cried out for what gold could not heal, and Amara, unseen and uncelebrated, was the only one who heard it. Before I tell you what came next, I need to know, where are you watching from? Do not just listen in silence. In this story, silence was the deadliest mistake of all. Madame Folake's eyes narrowed as she watched her husband's gaze linger on Amara. To her, this was humiliation, a servant stealing attention in front of the city's finest. To her, Amara was nothing more than a shadow, but what she could not see was that the shadow she despised had once been the very light that saved him. And so the whispers grew. Wealthy men in polished suits shook their heads. Women in gowns turned away, scandal painted across their faces. Yet still Amara remained. Her trembling voice pleaded for a single kiss, not out of desire, but as a symbol that would unlock the memory he had buried beneath wealth and pride. And deep within Adewale's chest, something stirred, a flicker of recognition. A boy barefoot in the dirt, a bowl of food placed before him, a woman's calloused hand resting on his shoulder, and the promise he made to himself that he would never forget. A promise broken by time and power. The flashbacks rushed upon him like a flood, the faint taste of yam his starving lips once received, the sound of Amara's laughter as a child when she shared her own portion with him, the way her mother's voice cracked when she said, "Eat, boy, my daughter will understand." And he did eat. He ate the food of the poor, the kindness of strangers, the sacrifices of those who had nothing. And when he grew strong enough to stand again, he left. He left the village, left the woman who saved him, left the little girl who had once been his sister in spirit. He promised to return, but promises are fragile things in the hands of ambition. Years turned to decades. Success buried the past. Mansions rose where hunger once lived, and now the boy who once begged for scraps was the man others bowed before. But that night, with his body weakened and his strength fading, the truth came roaring back through Amara's tears. If you carried the memory of someone else's sacrifice, if you alone remembered while the rest of the world forgot, would you speak it aloud, or would you stay silent? Tell me in the comments. The room could no longer contain the weight of her truth. The wife's anger, the guest's whispers, the master's trembling hands, all collided in a single moment where past and present stood face to face. And then it happened. Adewale, weakened but shaken awake by memory, reached for her. The same man who had forgotten, the same man who had turned his back on poverty, now looked into the eyes of the maid who carried his past. And in that look, the guests saw scandal. But Amara saw redemption. It was not a kiss of passion she sought. It was not love in the way they understood it. It was a bridge, from who he had been to who he had become. And though the crowd recoiled in shock, though his wife's fury burned like fire, Amara knew the truth had finally been spoken, not in words, but in a single gesture. And in that moment, the mansion no longer echoed with music or laughter. It echoed with the clash of memory and pride, of love unspoken and debts unpaid. A kiss requested, a truth revealed, a life turned upside down before the eyes of all. But this was not the end. For when the past breaks into the present, the consequences are never simple. And what followed that night would shatter more than one heart. It would expose the fragile line between wealth and humility, between loyalty and betrayal, between silence and truth. The room did not return to laughter that night. No music followed the silence. No toast lifted the air. Instead, suspicion spread like wildfire. Madame Folake's eyes burned with humiliation as she watched her husband's gaze linger too long on the servant girl. To her, Amara's trembling plea was a threat, not a symbol, not a secret, but a betrayal dressed as pity. And so, behind the polished smiles of her guests, her thoughts grew sharp. How long had this maid been waiting for such a moment? How many times had she crossed the line of loyalty, inch by inch, until tonight when she dared to make herself visible before all? To the wife, it was scandal. But to Amara, it was the release of a promise kept too long in silence. Still, the crowd did not understand. They whispered of shame, of impropriety, of lines crossed. But they did not see the threads of history woven into Amara's tears. They did not see the image of a boy saved from death, standing now as a man too weak to stand, and in that blindness, judgment grew. Tell me, where are you watching from? Because what comes next will make you question loyalty itself, and you must not be silent. Later, when the guests had been forced into uneasy laughter, when the music struggled to return but never truly did, Amara was pulled aside. She was cornered in a quiet hallway, away from the chandeliers and the polished marble, and there stood Madame Folake, elegant, unflinching, her words dripping like poison no ear but Amara's could hear. Do not mistake kindness for invitation, her tone implied. Do not mistake your service for importance. But Amara did not answer. She did not need to, for within her she carried a truth no insult could erase. The memory of a starving boy, her mother's sacrifice, her own childhood hunger traded away to keep him alive. These memories, sharper than any blade, made her strong where others saw weakness. Still, suspicion had been planted, and in houses built on wealth and pride, suspicion grows faster than vines on stone. As the night deepened, Adewale sat alone in his study. His body weakened, but his mind restless. The echoes of Amara's plea rang louder than the music that once filled the hall. In her face, he had seen his past. In her tears, he had seen his debt. And in her request, he had seen the weight of a promise he had long broken. He remembered the first time he entered her home, dirt on his skin, ribs showing through his thin frame, eyes hollow with hunger. He remembered her mother's hand pressing food into his palm, though her own stomach growled with emptiness. He remembered Amara herself, young and innocent, smiling as she shared her bread, not knowing she was giving away what little she had, and yet he had left them. He had risen without looking back. And now, the reminder of all he owed stood before him not as a guest, not as an equal, but as a maid kneeling at his feet. Guilt gnawed at him. For all his wealth, he had never repaid the debt that gave him life. If you were him, if the past returned to demand repayment, what would you do? Would you admit your failure, or hide it deeper beneath pride? Tell me in the comments. Whispers spread beyond the walls of the mansion. By morning, the city hummed with rumor. They spoke of a maid who dared to humiliate her master. They spoke of a scandal that stripped dignity from a house of wealth. They did not speak of sacrifice, of hunger, of promises. They spoke only of shame. And soon, those whispers reached ears that should never have heard them. Business partners, associates, rivals. They saw opportunity in the scandal. A man who once stood untouchable now seemed weak, exposed, vulnerable. And in their hands, the story twisted into a weapon. But Amara had not spoken to defend herself. She had not told her truth to the gossiping tongues or the sneering guests. Her silence was not weakness. Her silence was strength, because she knew that when the time came, it would not be her voice that revealed the truth. It would be his. Do not stay silent while others twist the truth. If you remain silent, "You are no different from those who watched Amara suffer and said nothing." And so it began. The fall of silence into confrontation, the weight of memory pressing against the pride of wealth, the collision of past and present. Amara's request for a kiss was never about love. It was about revelation. And though the world laughed, though the wife scorned, though the city whispered, Adewale knew in the pit of his soul the time had come to face the truth he had buried. But the truth never arrives alone. It brings consequences. And in the days that followed, what was once hidden behind the golden walls of a mansion would spill into the streets, tearing apart the very foundations on which his empire had been built. And so, while the world prepared to witness a celebration, Naomi carried within her a storm no one else could see. Every smile she offered was carefully rehearsed, every gesture calculated, as though masking a truth too dangerous to be revealed. Elijah, standing beside her, looked flawless to the untrained eye. His laughter filled the halls, his charm disarmed suspicion. Yet, if one paid attention closely, there was something in his eyes. A hesitation, a flicker of unease, as though part of him feared that the mask might slip. The household was alive with noise. Servants hurried through corridors, relatives whispered in corners, and music from rehearsals floated through the air. Yet in the midst of this noise, silence grew. A silence between Naomi and Elijah. They spoke less, avoided each other's gaze, and when their hands touched, there was no warmth, only questions left unspoken. But Naomi was not blind. She had seen signs, little details no one else noticed. Elijah's late nights justified with flimsy excuses. A misplaced letter hidden among his belongings, a shadow that passed by the gate when he claimed to be alone. Each clue small, almost meaningless on its own, but together they painted an image that gnawed at her heart. And then there was the maid, quiet, humble, often overlooked. Yet she had been there through it all, silent witness to the unfolding drama. The maid carried secrets she had not yet dared to tell, secrets that linked her fate to Naomi's in ways no one could have foreseen. But the true question remained. What would force a maid to stand before her wealthy employer and ask for something as forbidden, as unimaginable, as a kiss? The answer was a tragedy waiting to be unwrapped. And before I reveal what happened that night, let me ask you this. If you were Naomi, if everything you trusted suddenly cracked before your eyes, what would you have done? Would you walk away quietly? Or would you stay, demanding answers no matter the cost? Tell me in the comments below, because as you're about to see, silence was no longer an option. That night, the house was still. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, carrying with it a low hum, as though nature itself was whispering warnings that no one dared to hear. Candles burned low in the long corridors, their flames bending and stretching against the draft, throwing shadows across the walls. Naomi could not sleep. Her heart thudded with a rhythm too loud to ignore. She rose from her bed, the silk of her gown whispering against the floor, and walked slowly toward the balcony. From there she could see the vast estate stretched beneath the moonlight, every stone pathway, every garden hedge perfectly in place. Perfect, just as everyone believed her life to be, but perfection, she knew now, was an illusion. And then she heard it, soft, muffled voices echoing faintly through the hall. At first, she thought it was the guards exchanging words at the gate, but as she leaned closer, pressing her ear to the heavy wooden door, the voices grew clearer. Elijah's voice, low, hurried, urgent, and another voice, softer, a woman's. Naomi's blood ran cold. She held her breath, straining to hear, but the words were fragments, pieces, enough to unsettle her, but not enough to fully understand. The sound of footsteps followed, light, careful, and then silence again. Her body trembled as she backed away from the door. It could have been anyone, a guest, a servant, a relative. But her heart whispered otherwise. Deep down, she already knew. The maid. That same maid whose eyes always lowered whenever Naomi entered the room. That same maid who always seemed to linger a second too long when Elijah spoke. That same maid whose silence was not submission, but something else, something hidden. Naomi clenched her fists. Tomorrow, she promised herself, she would find the truth. But what she didn't know was that the truth was already waiting for her, and once it revealed itself, her life would never again be the same. And before I take you into that moment, let me ask you this. Would you want to know the truth if it risked destroying everything you loved? Or would you rather live in the comfort of a beautiful lie? Comment your answer, because Naomi was about to face that choice, and she could not turn back. All right, let's keep the suspense building. We'll move straight into the next day, when Naomi's suspicion takes form and the first shocking moment unfolds. Morning came, but the sunlight brought no peace. It poured through the grand windows in golden streams, illuminating a house that looked pristine to outsiders. Yet Naomi felt only the weight of unease pressing upon her chest. Servants hurried about, preparing the estate for another day of endless rehearsals and endless smiles. Elijah moved among them, carrying himself with the same charm, the same practiced ease. But Naomi's eyes no longer looked at him as a bride-to-be looks at her beloved. She watched him instead, as a hunter watches prey, patient, calculating, waiting for the moment when truth exposes itself. And it came sooner than she expected. She followed him quietly, her steps hidden by the sound of music drifting through the halls. Elijah's stride was quick, purposeful, as though he knew where he was going, and more importantly, who he was going to meet. Naomi's heartbeat quickened. Her palms grew damp. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall as he turned into the east wing, a place seldom used, reserved for guests who never came. There, just beyond the archway, Naomi saw them. Elijah stood too close to the maid, far too close. His hand brushed hers as though it belonged there. And the maid, her head bowed, her voice soft, spoke words Naomi could barely catch, but enough to shatter her world. "Please, don't let her find out." Naomi's chest tightened, her vision blurred. It was as though the floor itself betrayed her, shifting beneath her feet. She wanted to storm forward, to scream, to demand answers, but something stronger held her back. She needed more. She needed certainty. So she stayed hidden in the shadows, trembling as Elijah reached out and touched the maid's face. That single gesture, gentle, intimate, forbidden, was the confirmation Naomi had feared. The man she had chosen, the man she was about to vow her life to, was not hers alone. And the maid, silent and unassuming, held a piece of him that Naomi was never meant to see. But Naomi had seen, and there was no going back. Her world had split open, and only one path remained. And before I tell you how Naomi confronted the storm that awaited her, I must ask you, if you discovered such betrayal on the eve of your wedding, would you expose it before the world, or would you wait, gathering proof until the perfect moment? Share your thoughts in the comments, because Naomi was about to make that very choice, and her decision would change everything. Perfect. Let's take the suspense deeper, shifting Naomi from silent witness to a woman preparing her next move. That night, the estate was quieter than ever before. Laughter had faded, footsteps slowed, and even the air itself seemed heavy with the weight of secrets left unspoken. Naomi lay in her chambers, her body motionless but her mind alive with fire. Sleep would not come, not after what she had seen. Her eyes replayed every detail, the way Elijah leaned toward the maid, the tremor in the maid's voice, the tenderness of that forbidden touch. Each memory cut into her like shards of glass. She turned from side to side, but no position could comfort her, no pillow could absorb the ache. And so Naomi rose. She moved to her desk, lit a single candle, and began writing in her journal, words she could not dare speak aloud, words of betrayal, of humiliation, of rage. Each sentence pressed into the page with such force The ink nearly tore through the paper. But journaling was not enough. She needed answers, proof, a plan. And that's when her thoughts shifted from pain to purpose. She remembered the subtle clues she had ignored before, the hidden letter, the late nights, the maid's nervous glances. Together they formed a puzzle that demanded solving. Naomi stood by her window, looking out into the moonlit courtyard. Somewhere in that same house, Elijah slept soundly, unaware that the woman he thought pliant and blind was now awake, sharper than ever, and ready to unmask him. She clenched her fists. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of a vow. Tomorrow, I will know the truth. All of it. And for the first time since her world had begun to unravel, Naomi felt clarity. The wedding would no longer be a simple ceremony of vows and roses. It would be a reckoning. But how? Would she confront Elijah directly, risking lies and denial? Or would she wait, gather more evidence, and expose him when escape was impossible, before every eye in attendance? This was the question that consumed her as the candle burned lower, its flame flickering like the last fragile hope of her trust. And now, dear listener, I ask you, if you were Naomi, would you choose a private confrontation? Or would you wait to strike in public, before the entire gathering? Which path would cut deepest? Leave your answer in the comments, because Naomi's choice would decide not just her future, but Elijah's downfall. The dawn broke gently over the estate, but for Naomi, the morning carried no peace. She stood before her mirror as the first rays of light painted her face in a soft glow. To anyone watching, she would have appeared flawless. Hair arranged, gown elegant, composure steady. But inside, her heart was a battlefield. This was the day she would move from silence to action. As servants bustled about, preparing for the final rehearsals before the wedding, Naomi moved quietly through the halls, her steps measured, her expression unreadable. She greeted guests with a faint smile, answered their well-meaning questions, but all the while her mind was elsewhere. She was not thinking of vows or blessings. She was thinking of the maid, humble, trembling, carrying secrets she had not yet dared to reveal. Naomi knew now that the girl was the thread. Pull her story, and the entire fabric of Elijah's lies would come undone. Naomi watched carefully. She saw the way Elijah avoided the maid's gaze at breakfast, how the girl's hands shook as she poured wine, how her eyes darted to the floor whenever Naomi looked her way. Guilt had a way of revealing itself, not in confessions, but in hesitation. And Naomi was watching everything. Later that afternoon, she sent for the maid. Alone in the quiet of her chambers, Naomi closed the door and let silence linger. The maid stood with her hands clasped, eyes lowered, as though waiting for judgment. Naomi's voice was calm but sharp. "Tell me the truth. Do not lie to me. What is it that binds you to Elijah?" The maid froze. A single tear welled in her eye, though her lips remained sealed. Naomi stepped closer, her gaze unwavering, her words deliberate. "You owe me nothing but honesty. Speak now, or remain forever in chains of silence." The maid trembled. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I never wanted this." But he would not let me go. Naomi's chest tightened. The answer was not complete, not yet, but it was enough to confirm what she had long feared. Elijah had crossed a line no vow could mend, and still, the maid's story was unfinished. Naomi took her hand gently, a strange mercy in her touch. "Then you will tell me everything, every word, every detail, tonight." The maid nodded weakly, as though a weight she could no longer carry was at last being taken from her. And so it was set. By nightfall, Naomi would have the truth. But truth, as you will see, is never as simple as we wish it to be. Sometimes it wounds deeper than betrayal itself. Before I reveal what the maid confessed, let me ask you this. Would you want to know the full truth, even if it destroyed the life you built? Or would you choose ignorance, clinging to the illusion of happiness. Share your thoughts, because Naomi had already chosen her path. The night came quietly, draped in velvet darkness, but for Naomi the silence carried a weight that pressed on her chest. The candles in her chamber flickered nervously, as if they, too, awaited the unveiling of secrets that had been hidden too long. The maid arrived at the appointed hour. She stepped in slowly, eyes downcast, shoulders bent under the gravity of what she carried. Naomi dismissed the other attendants and locked the door behind them. 2 women remained, one bound by a vow of marriage, the other bound by a chain of shame. Naomi gestured for her to sit, though the maid lingered standing. Her hands twisted the hem of her apron, and her lips parted, only to close again. The silence stretched. Finally, Naomi whispered, "Speak," and the flood began. The maid's words came trembling at first, then faster, as though she feared that if she stopped, courage would abandon her. She spoke of nights stolen in secret corners of the estate, of whispered promises Elijah had made, promises that carried the perfume of love but stank of ownership. She told of how he pressed her into a kiss not out of affection but out of power, and how her heart shattered when she realized she was no more than a hidden possession. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Naomi sat motionless, her own heart breaking, not only for herself, but for the girl before her. She had once believed betrayal was a wound inflicted only on her. Now she saw it stretched wider, seeping through lives that had no defense. Then came the detail Naomi had not expected. The maid confessed in a whisper, voice barely audible. "I asked him once to kiss me, not because I wanted him, but because I wanted him to admit it, to admit what he had done to me, so I would not feel like I was losing my mind. I needed to know if it was real or if I had imagined everything, and he did. He kissed me, and in that moment I knew. His loyalty to you was already gone." The words struck Naomi like a blade. Her chest tightened. She rose from her seat, pacing the chamber. This was not merely betrayal of passion. It was betrayal of the soul, the desecration of trust she had built her life upon. The maid wept harder, crumpling to her knees. "I never wanted to hurt you. I only wanted to survive." Naomi looked down at her, torn between fury and compassion. For a moment, her fingers curled as if to strike, but instead she reached out, lifting the maid gently. "You are not my enemy," Naomi said at last, her voice heavy with both pain and resolve. "But the truth cannot stay hidden." At that moment, Naomi's reflection in the tall mirror caught her eye. She no longer saw a bride-to-be. She saw a woman standing at the edge of war, torn between love and justice, torn between silence and revelation. One decision remained. Would she march to the altar as though nothing had been said? Or would she shatter the ceremony, exposing Elijah for all the world to see? The choice lay before her like a dagger on the table. Before I tell you which path Naomi chose, I need to ask you something. If you were her, standing on the eve of your wedding, armed with a truth that could destroy everything, would you still walk to the altar? Or would you burn it all down in front of the world? Tell me in the comments. Because the way Naomi acted next, no one in that estate would ever forget. The dawn of the wedding day came with deceptive beauty. The sun broke through the clouds in a blaze of gold, the gardens hummed with birdsong, and the scent of roses drifted on the breeze. To the villagers who gathered outside the estate, it was the day of promise, a celebration of union. But to Naomi, it was the day she would decide between silence and exposure, between preserving her image or tearing down the veil of lies. Her attendants dressed her in silks, layered with jewels that glistened like tears she had not yet shed. They whispered blessings in her ear, but their words fell hollow. Naomi's mind replayed the confession of the maid, the trembling voice, the shame, the moment she admitted asking Elijah to kiss her, not out of love, but out of desperation for truth. That image burned into Naomi's soul. She stared into the mirror. The veil covered her face, but behind it her eyes were sharp, alive, blazing with a decision only she knew. Outside, Elijah stood waiting. He was adorned in his finery, smiling at the guests, laughing as though nothing weighed upon him. His charm wrapped the crowd in comfort, yet Naomi saw through it. She saw the cracks, the duplicity, the man who had betrayed not just her, but the maid who now trembled somewhere in the shadows of the estate, fearing the consequences of her confession. The music swelled. The doors to the chapel opened. Naomi stepped forward, every eye upon her. The crowd gasped at her beauty, but they could not see the storm within. With each step toward the altar, her heart beat louder. She heard her own voice inside. Do I protect his name, or do I protect my dignity? Do I hold my tongue, or do I speak for those silenced by his power? She reached the front. Elijah took her hand, his smile wide, his grip firm, his eyes glowing with the confidence of a man who believed his secrets buried forever. The priest lifted his hand to begin the ceremony. The first words of blessing fell into the air. Naomi's chest heaved. She looked out at the crowd. Families, friends, elders of the village. Her voice fought to rise in her throat. The question boiled inside her. Do I shatter this day? Do I unmask him here, before God and all who witness? Her lips parted. The entire chapel leaned forward, waiting. And then, but before I reveal what Naomi said in that sacred moment, I need to ask you something. If betrayal lay hidden beneath the smile of the one you were about to marry, would you stay silent to keep peace? Or would you tear the truth into the open, no matter the cost? Leave your answer in the comments, because Naomi's decision here is where the story shifts forever. Naomi's lips trembled, but her voice cut through the air like a blade. Wait. The single word froze the ceremony. The priest lowered his hand. The crowd shifted, a murmur spreading like ripples on still water. Elijah's smile faltered. He glanced at her, expecting perhaps a shy correction or a nervous laugh. But what he saw instead was fire in her eyes. Naomi pulled her hand from his grip. She turned to the gathered crowd, her veil lifting as she spoke louder, stronger. You see before you a man dressed in honor, she said, her voice carrying to the furthest corners of the chapel. But honor without truth is a lie, and a wedding built on lies cannot stand. Gasps echoed. Some guests stood, others whispered frantically. Elijah reached for her hand again, his voice low, urgent. Naomi, not here. Not now. But Naomi stepped away from him, her gown sweeping across the floor like a storm. She pointed, not at Elijah, but at the back of the chapel where the maid stood, trembling, half hidden in the shadows. She came to me, Naomi declared, her voice quivering with both pain and courage. She told me what happened. She told me why she asked for that kiss, not out of desire, but to uncover the truth of his loyalty, and what she found. Her voice broke for a moment, then strengthened again. What she found was betrayal. The crowd gasped louder, mothers covered their mouths, fathers frowned in disapproval, children clutched at their parents' hands. Elijah's face paled. He stepped forward, desperation bleeding into his voice. Naomi, stop this madness. She lies. She seeks to ruin us. But Naomi's gaze did not waver. Does she, or do you? The silence in the room was deafening. Every eye turned from Naomi to Elijah, waiting for his answer. The maid lowered her head, tears streaming down her cheeks, her frail body shaking under the weight of so many stares. Naomi walked toward her, slowly, with dignity. She took the maid's hand and lifted her chin, forcing her to meet her gaze. You are not to blame, Naomi whispered, her voice carrying the softness of compassion, yet the weight of judgment. The one who should carry shame is the man who swore love to me while hiding his heart in deceit. The guests erupted in murmurs, some crying out in anger at Elijah, others stunned in silence. Naomi turned back to the altar, her veil slipping fully to the ground. Her voice was steady, her verdict final. This wedding ends here, for love without truth is no love at all, and I will not bind my soul to falsehood. With those words, she tore the ring from her finger and placed it at Elijah's feet. The chapel descended into chaos. Some applauded her bravery, others shook their heads in disbelief. Elijah bent to pick up the ring, but as his fingers touched it, Naomi walked past him, past the priest, past the stunned faces of friends and family. The maid followed close behind, still crying, yet clinging to Naomi's presence like a lifeline. Outside the sun still shone, but for Elijah the world had dimmed. His empire of charm and power had cracked before the eyes of all who once praised him, and in its place, truth had risen, carried on the voice of a woman who refused to be silent. My friend, pause and think. Would you have walked away like Naomi did, or would you have stayed, choosing silence to keep peace, even at the cost of your dignity? Comment your answer below. And if you believe Naomi's courage deserves to be remembered, tap the subscribe button so you never miss the next story that carries truth in its veins. The doors of the chapel slammed behind Naomi, the sound echoing like a gavel striking judgment. The world outside was quiet, the sunlight pouring over her like freedom itself, yet freedom came with weight of whispers, of eyes that would follow, of a life forever marked by this moment. The maid walked close, trembling. She clutched Naomi's hand as if fearing she would let go. "You should hate me," the maid whispered, her voice cracked with guilt. "You should despise me for what I told you, for what I brought upon you." Naomi stopped, her gown still brushing against the stone steps as she turned to face her. For a moment, she simply stared at her, breathing in the heaviness of betrayal, the sharp sting of shame. Then, gently, she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice firm yet tender. "You did not break me. You freed me. Truth is never an enemy, even when it hurts." Tears welled in the maid's eyes. She collapsed into Naomi's arms, sobbing openly. Passers-by stopped to watch. Some pointed whispering judgments. Others looked on in admiration. For the scene unfolding was not of scandal, but of courage. Two women bound not by shame, but by the unveiling of truth. Inside the chapel, Elijah stood still, frozen as the priest tried to calm the furious murmurs. Guests were leaving, shaking their heads, muttering words that would cling to Elijah's reputation like thorns. His father approached him, fury carved into his face. "You've shamed us," the old man hissed. "Do you realize what you've done? Your name, our family's name, will be spat upon in this town." But Elijah's eyes were fixed on the door where Naomi had vanished. He clenched the ring in his hand until his knuckles turned white. His voice broke, low and strangled. "She was supposed to be mine. She was supposed to forgive me." But forgiveness is not demanded. It is earned, and Elijah had squandered it long before the ceremony began. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, Naomi sat by her window. The maid had prepared tea, but could barely meet her eyes. Silence stretched between them until Naomi spoke softly. "Do you know what the hardest part was?" she asked, her gaze lost in the horizon. "It wasn't leaving him at the altar. It wasn't facing the stares or the whispers. It was realizing I loved a man who never truly loved me back. That was the real wound." The maid lowered her head, ashamed, but Naomi reached out and touched her hand. "Don't carry this burden as yours. The fault is his alone." And in that moment the bond between them shifted. No longer mistress and servant. No longer one bound by guilt and the other by betrayal. But two women, standing in the ashes of deception, vowing never to let silence be their prison again. Elijah, however, would not let go. Days passed, and whispers of his disgrace spread from household to household. Invitations ceased. Business partners avoided him. Friends offered polite smiles but carried mocking smirks behind his back. His pride turned to desperation, and desperation always leads to dangerous choices. He began sending letters to Naomi, pleading, begging, swearing that the kiss meant nothing, that he was a fool blinded by a moment of weakness. The letters grew darker, more frantic, until one reached her that chilled her to the bone. "If I cannot have you as my bride," he wrote, "then I will ensure no one else ever shall." Naomi read those words by candlelight, her fingers trembling, her breath caught in her chest. She pressed the paper flat against the table, staring at it as if the ink itself had fangs. She knew then. The story was not over. What had begun as a ruined wedding was becoming something far more dangerous. Something that could cost her not just her heart, but her life. Friend, pause for a moment. What would you do if you received such a letter from someone you once loved? Would you go to the authorities? Would you forgive and risk your safety, or would you disappear into silence? Share your answer in the comments. And if you want to follow Naomi's journey into this dangerous new chapter, make sure you hit subscribe, because the truth is only just beginning to unravel. Night fell heavier than usual, cloaking the town in silence. Naomi sat in her chamber, the letter still on the table before her. The ink shimmered faintly in the candlelight, and those words, those chilling words, seemed to whisper themselves again and again into her ears. "If I cannot have you as my bride, then I will ensure no one else ever shall." Her maid had begged her to burn the letter, to erase it, to pretend it never arrived. But Naomi refused. She knew that erasing evidence meant erasing warning, and she had already lived once in blind trust, never again. The following morning, Naomi went to the parish priest. His office was lined with books of scripture, and the faint smell of incense clung to the air. She placed the letter before him, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "Father," she said, "he is no longer a man in shame. He is a man consumed by obsession. I fear what he may do." The priest lifted the letter, his brows knitting as he read. When his eyes rose to meet hers, they carried not comfort, but a shadow of unease. "Naomi," he said gravely, "men who write such words are men who act upon them. He must be stopped before harm is done. But," his voice faltered, "his family wields power. They will deny, they will twist, they will protect him." Her chest tightened. The priest was right. Elijah's family had influence. They owned land, held sway in the council, and their name carried weight in every corner of town. To speak against him would not only invite ridicule, but possibly danger. Still, Naomi's voice rose, quiet but firm. "Then let them come. I would rather face their wrath than live in silence, waiting for him in the shadows." Meanwhile, Elijah's descent deepened. His once proud estate had grown eerily quiet, its halls echoing only with his restless pacing. Food went untouched. He sat in the dark, muttering Naomi's name as though it were both prayer and curse. Servants whispered of the change in him. They spoke of nights when he would leave and return only at dawn, his clothes muddied, his eyes wild. Some said he lingered near Naomi's home watching. Others claimed they saw him slip into the woods with something gleaming in his hand. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: Elijah was no longer the man who once charmed an entire town. He had become something else entirely, something hollow, dangerous, unpredictable. Naomi tried to resume her days, walking through the marketplace, speaking kindly to the villagers, offering smiles where she could. But every time she turned a corner, she felt it, that invisible gaze upon her, that shadow that lingered just long enough to raise the hairs on her neck. The maid grew nervous, urging her not to go out alone, yet Naomi refused to surrender her freedom. She would not let fear cage her. But one evening, as twilight deepened and the streets emptied, she realized she was no longer alone. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, slow, deliberate, matching her pace. Her heart quickened. She turned sharply, but the street lay empty, bathed only in the fading glow of lanterns. Still, the feeling pressed upon her chest like a weight. She began to walk faster, clutching her shawl close. And then, from the shadows, a voice called out, "Naomi!" It was Elijah. He stepped forward, his figure half hidden in the dim light. His hair was unkempt, his clothes disheveled, his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you shame me? Why would you abandon me when you were mine?" Naomi froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to run, but her legs betrayed her, locked in fear. "Elijah," she managed, her voice trembling yet resolute. "You lost me long before that day. What you did, what you planned, it destroyed everything." But his lips curled into a broken smile, and his voice dropped low. "No, you don't understand. You are still mine, and if I cannot have you—" His hand slipped behind his back. "Then no one will. Pause for a moment, friend. Imagine you were Naomi in this moment, standing face to face with a man you once loved, now twisted by obsession. What would you do? Stand your ground? Flee into the night? Or beg for mercy? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because Naomi's choice in the next breath could mean the difference between life and death. And if you want to see how far Elijah's obsession truly goes, don't just watch, subscribe, because what happens next will shake you. Naomi's breath shivered in her chest. Elijah's shadow loomed closer, his hand still hidden behind his back, the madness in his eyes no longer the flicker of a broken man, but the blaze of something unhinged. She took a step back. Her voice, though shaking, refused to break. "Elijah, this ends tonight." For a heartbeat the street fell silent. Only the distant creak of a swinging lantern and the whisper of the wind accompanied their standoff. Then he lunged. A flash of steel glinted in his hand. Naomi turned sharply, her shawl slipping from her shoulders as she fled. The cobblestones clattered beneath her feet, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. Behind her, Elijah's footsteps thundered, each one closer, faster, more desperate. She darted into an alley, the walls closing in around her, her breath ragged. Ahead, the faint light of the parish door spilled into the night. Salvation. She sprinted toward it, and just as Elijah's hand reached for her arm, the heavy church door swung open. The priest stood there, candle in hand. Behind him, several townsfolk had gathered, drawn by Naomi's cries. Elijah froze, his wild eyes darting from the priest to the crowd, his grip on the blade tightening. "Enough!" the priest's voice rang out, firm, commanding. "This is not love. This is ruin. Release her." For a moment, Elijah trembled. His jaw clenched. His chest rose and fell in sharp bursts. Then his gaze flicked to Naomi, her eyes wide with fear, yet unwavering. She wasn't his. She never would be again. A sound broke from his throat, half sob, half growl, and then slowly he dropped the knife. It clattered against the stones. The townsfolk surged forward, seizing him, pulling him back as he thrashed and screamed her name. Naomi collapsed to her knees, trembling, the weight of the night pressing down upon her. But she was alive. In the days that followed, Elijah was confined, his family powerless to shield him from the truth the town had witnessed with their own eyes. He became a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors, how love, once poisoned by pride and obsession, can decay into something far darker. Naomi, though shaken, walked forward with dignity. She had faced the storm and survived. She carried the scars, yes, but also the strength of one who had stared madness in the face and refused to bow. Her wedding day had not bound her to tragedy, it had unbound her from chains. And so the tale closes, not with romance, but with revelation. That love is not possession, not control, not obsession cloaked in passion. True love frees, false love binds. And when faced with the false, one must have the courage to walk away. Tell me, friend, what lesson do you see in Naomi's choice? Do you believe Elijah's obsession was madness, or the final shape of a prideful heart unrepentant? Share your thoughts below, and if this story gripped you, don't forget, subscribe. Because every tale we uncover here carries not just drama but a mirror reflecting what lurks in us all.